The Battle of Saipan, fought from June 15 to the 9th of July 1944, stands as one of the most significant confrontations in the Pacific theater of World War II. It was strategically crucial for the United States, as it aimed to capture the Mariana Islands, which would provide airfields for the eventual bombing of Japan. On the other side, the Japanese forces, led by General Yoshitsugu Saito, were determined to prevent the U.S. from gaining control of the islands. They believed that a successful defense of Saipan could change the course of the war and protect Japan's home islands. Saipan was considered a key island for both the Americans and the Japanese. For the Americans, taking Saipan meant securing a base from which they could launch air raids directly into Japan. For the Japanese, losing Saipan would open up the path for further U.S. advances towards their homeland. The Japanese military's sense of honor, duty, and its deeply ingrained culture of sacrifice led many to believe that they could hold the island against the advancing U.S. forces, no matter the cost. This mindset would lead to one of the most desperate and deadly moments in the battle. The concept of the Banzai charge had become emblematic of Japanese military tactics during the war. The Banzai, which translates to 10,000 years of life, was a battle cry that represented both defiance and the ultimate sacrifice. In the eyes of the Japanese soldiers, charging into battle with the cry of Banzai was not only an act of courage, but also an attempt to sway the course of the war with an all-or-nothing gamble. It reflected the belief that individual courage and sacrifice could somehow turn the tide in their favor, even against overwhelming odds. As the battle raged on and the Americans steadily advanced, the Japanese forces became increasingly cornered. By early July, it was clear to the Japanese command that Saipan was lost. General Saito, aware of the hopelessness of their position, began preparing for one final desperate measure. He ordered the formation of a massive Banzai charge, hoping that this symbolic and overwhelming attack could either break the Americans or inflict enough damage to force them into a costly retreat. It was an all-out effort to regain control of the island, though they knew it was unlikely. On the night of the 6th of July, 1944, the Japanese launched the Banzai charge. Around 4,300 Japanese soldiers, armed with little more than rifles and bayonets, charged at the U.S. lines in a frenzied assault. The Japanese soldiers were driven by a sense of duty, honor, and desperation. They believed that the shock of such an overwhelming charge could break the Americans' resolve and change the outcome of the battle. What followed was a night of unimaginable bloodshed, as the U.S. Marines, though vastly outnumbered, were well prepared for such an attack. The American response to the Banzai charge was swift and deadly. The Marines had superior firepower, including machine guns, artillery, and close air support, which they used to devastating effect. As the Japanese soldiers advanced, the Marines unleashed a withering barrage of fire, cutting down wave after wave of attackers. The Banzai charge was meant to overwhelm the American defenses through sheer force and will, but it was met with the full might of the U.S. military, which had been trained to deal with such desperate charges. The scale of the destruction was overwhelming. In just a few hours, over 4,000 Japanese soldiers were killed. The Banzai charge was supposed to be a final, decisive action, but instead, it became a symbol of the futility of the Japanese cause. The attack was routed before it could reach the American lines, and the cost for the Japanese was catastrophic. It became apparent that no matter how fiercely the soldiers fought or how many were sacrificed, the Japanese were unable to stop the U.S. advance. The attack was also a tragic testament to the mindset of the Japanese soldiers. They were willing to die in combat, believing it would honor their nation and their emperor. This mindset was deeply rooted in Japanese culture, which placed high value on sacrifice, duty, and loyalty. However, the futile Banzai charge revealed the fundamental miscalculation of the Japanese military, that human sacrifice could not alter the course of a war dominated by superior technology, resources, and strategy. For the U.S. Marines, the night of July 6 was a critical moment in the battle. While they suffered some casualties, the majority of the Japanese forces were wiped out. The Marines' preparation and superior tactics ensured that they could repel the Banzai charge with minimal losses. The Banzai attack had shown the world that the Japanese would fight to the bitter end, but it also highlighted the incredible effectiveness of American firepower and coordination. Following the failure of the Banzai charge, the remaining Japanese forces in Saipan were either killed or forced into hiding. The U.S. forces, now with near complete control of the island, continued their operations. The fall of Saipan was a turning point in the Pacific War, as it provided the U.S. with a base that was within striking distance of the Japanese home islands. The loss was a devastating blow to the Japanese, both strategically and psychologically. The Japanese military's decision to conduct a Banzai charge was indicative of their mindset in the latter years of the war. Faced with defeat and the impending loss of Saipan, they were willing to embrace a strategy of hopeless sacrifice. This reflected their belief in fighting until the last man, a concept that had been ingrained in them by both military tradition and imperial propaganda. However, this desperation was also a reflection of the dire situation Japan found itself in as the tide of the war turned against them. The U.S. victory at Saipan marked the beginning of a new phase in the Pacific War. With Saipan under American control, the U.S. was able to launch strategic bombing campaigns against the Japanese mainland. The use of B-29 bombers from Saipan provided the Americans with a key advantage, allowing them to strike at Japan's industrial centers and military installations. The loss of Saipan was therefore a pivotal moment, as it drastically diminished Japan's ability to defend itself against the American war machine. The psychological impact of the Banzai charge was felt deeply within Japan. The concept of the charge was rooted in the belief that the Japanese soldier could achieve victory through sheer willpower and sacrifice. However, the failure of the charge was an undeniable sign that such tactics were no longer effective against the overwhelming might of the United States. The Banzai charge was not only a failure in military terms, but also symbolized the unraveling of the Japanese imperial war effort. For the Marines, the battle for Saipan was not only about defeating the enemy, it was about surviving a brutal and unforgiving conflict. The Marines, many of whom had fought in previous island campaigns, understood that their success was due to a combination of technological superiority and tactical advantage. Yet, even with these advantages, the Marines still faced the full intensity of the Japanese will to fight. The Banzai charge was a stark reminder of the ferocity and determination of the enemy. In the aftermath of the battle, the U.S. military began to evaluate the psychological and tactical aspects of the Banzai charge. It was clear that while the Japanese could inspire their soldiers to fight with fanatical determination, they could not compete with the technological edge possessed by the Americans. The charge, though desperate and doomed, had been an attempt to level the playing field, but it only confirmed the growing superiority of American forces in the Pacific theater. As the Americans consolidated their control over Saipan, they were faced with the challenge of dealing with the remaining pockets of resistance. Many Japanese soldiers, rather than surrendering, chose to take their own lives or fight to the death in isolated skirmishes. This continued to reinforce the image of the Japanese soldier as someone willing to sacrifice everything for the empire, even in the face of inevitable defeat. The events on Saipan were not isolated, but part of a larger strategy by the United States to weaken Japan's capacity to continue the war. Saipan, along with the nearby island of Tinian, served as crucial stepping stones for the U.S. air raids on Japan. The B-29 bombers launched from Saipan would go on to devastate Japan, culminating in the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Saipan had, in essence, become the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. While the U.S. military celebrated its victory at Saipan, the aftermath of the battle left many questions about the conduct of the war and the Japanese response. The sacrifice of over 4,000 Japanese soldiers in a single night underscored the vast gulf in military doctrine between the two sides. The Americans had achieved their objectives, but at what cost to both sides? The Battle of Saipan was a tragedy for the Japanese, but also marked the beginning of the end for their war effort. As the war continued, the lessons learned from Saipan would influence the strategies used by both sides in subsequent battles. The U.S. would continue its island-hopping campaign, capturing key islands to pave the way for a final assault on Japan. The Japanese, on the other hand, would continue to employ their strategy of defense, but they were increasingly outmatched by American firepower and resources. The aftermath of Saipan was felt across the Pacific. For the United States, the victory was a crucial step toward ultimate victory in the Pacific War. For Japan, however, it was a devastating blow, both militarily and psychologically. The Banzai Charge, once a symbol of honor and sacrifice, had proven futile in the face of overwhelming American might. The battle also had profound cultural implications. The Banzai Charge symbolized the extent to which Japanese soldiers were willing to go to preserve their honor and defend their nation. But this act of extreme sacrifice, which had been a central theme in Japan's wartime ideology, ended up contributing to the nation's downfall. In the face of modern warfare and advanced technology, the old tactics of honor and sacrifice proved to be insufficient. As historians look back at the Battle of Saipan, they are reminded of the complexities of war. The Battle of Saipan was not just a military clash, but a reflection of the broader ideologies that shaped the war. The Japanese belief in the power of sacrifice, embodied in the Banzai Charge, met its tragic conclusion on the beaches of Saipan, while the American belief in technological superiority and overwhelming force proved decisive. The battle's aftermath also raised questions about the cost of victory. While the Americans were able to capture Saipan and use it as a launch point for further attacks on Japan, the human cost was significant. Thousands of soldiers on both sides lost their lives, and the toll on civilians was immense. The battle demonstrated the brutal nature of the war in the Pacific, where sacrifices were made by both soldiers and civilians alike. The fall of Saipan also marked a significant shift in the war's momentum. It was no longer a question of whether the U.S. would win the war, but how much longer Japan could hold out. With Saipan secured, the U.S. began its push closer to Japan, and the islands of the Pacific became the battlegrounds for one final confrontation. Saipan's fall was also a significant moral and psychological blow to Japan. The Banzai Charge had been an act of desperation, but it also symbolized the deep-rooted belief that Japan could still prevail in the war. The charge's failure shattered this illusion, as the Japanese soldiers realized that their cause was all but lost. In the larger scope of the Pacific War, Saipan's significance cannot be overstated. The battle represented a critical juncture where the U.S. began to systematically dismantle Japan's ability to wage war. The loss of Saipan, coupled with the failure of the Banzai Charge, signified the beginning of the end for the Japanese Empire. For the U.S. military, Saipan was not just a victory in military terms, but also a victory in psychological warfare. The failure of the Banzai Charge proved to the Japanese that their old ways of fighting were no longer effective. The charge represented a cultural and military paradigm shift, signaling the end of an era for Japan. After the fall of Saipan, the U.S. shifted its focus to the remaining islands of the Pacific, each one bringing them closer to Japan's home islands. While the battle for Saipan had been brutal, it also provided the U.S. with the necessary strategic advantage to continue its island-hopping campaign. The battle's legacy is still felt today. It serves as a reminder of the human cost of war and the resilience of soldiers on both sides. It is also a cautionary tale about the limits of honor and sacrifice in the face of modern warfare, where technology and resources often determine the outcome. Looking back, the Battle of Saipan offers important lessons about military strategy, the power of propaganda, and the tragic consequences of war. For the Japanese, the Banzai Charge became a symbol of their pride, but it also marked the collapse of their ability to resist the American war machine. For the United States, the victory at Saipan paved the way for a series of successful campaigns that would ultimately bring the war to a close.